Hello, and welcome to a joint webinar between LexisNexis Risk Solutions and Elliptic. In this webinar, we will talk about sanctions compliance for banks in the age of crypto assets. In your window, you should be able to see a Q&A box. If you have any technical issues, please post the questions in the box and one of our team members will assist you. The webinar will last roughly an hour. During that time, me and my co-host will go over our content, and we will allow for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we'll have roughly 10 minutes to address any questions. With that, feel free to send us any questions in the same Q&A box. Let's begin. Tom, could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So today, I am one of the co-hosts of the webinar. My name is Nina Krikes. I am Market Planning Director at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. I'm part of the International Financial Crime Compliance Market Planning team here at LexisNexis. I lead our FCC market strategy, business strategy, and my experiences in go-to-market when it comes to products that are linked to financial crime. With me today, I have Dr. Tom Robinson. He has also dressed up for this webinar with me for you guys. So Tom is a global expert in crypto assets, financial crime. He has advised various governments, tax authorities, and regulators on crypto assets. And he has done a lot of forensic analysis on Bitcoin transactions and has helped secure the convictions of cyber criminals. Tom, would you like to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. If you could move to the next slide, we can have a look at our agenda for today. So Tom and I will cover a variety of topics. Firstly, we'll look at the size of the problem that the criminal use of cryptocurrencies is actually, and so how are banks and other financial institutions distinguishing, some of these challenges that they're facing. Then we will move on to pick a real-life case scenario where we have tracked some of the money movements, crypto movements through exchanges, which I think will be very interesting to see. We'll talk about some of the actions that financial institutions should be taking today to prevent the misuse of cryptocurrencies. And finally, we will look at what is it that the regulators are doing today, and what does regulation actually look like when it comes to cryptocurrencies. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's begin. Let's start to have a look at how much of a problem the laundering of cryptocurrencies is. So next slide, Tom. We know actually that today financial crime is a huge problem to our society. So not only when we talk about the use of cryptocurrencies, but in general, when we talk about money laundering. So outlined on this slide, you actually see a lot of the issues that our society faces. And these issues are wide-ranging from, identity theft to human trafficking. And we know that today we're operating in an increasingly digital society. And for the purposes of today, we also want to focus on that. So we'll really focus on IT and cybercrime as issues. And so if we look at this slide, if you look at the size of the problems that, identity theft is or cybercrime, we know that $16 billion is actually, laundered on identity theft and $600 billion on cybercrime. So I want to unpick that a little bit further. If we move to the next slide, Tom. More specifically, when we talk about virtual assets, which have, become somewhat of a norm in our digital society, we want to point out the problem, the size of the challenge that we are facing here, obviously linked to virtual assets. So the figures on this slide are provided by Elliptic, and they estimate that around 200 billion of Bitcoins is moved through exchanges today. Now, we have to remember that not all exchanges, or not all those money movements are used for illicit purposes. A lot of them are just used for, legal money movements for cryptocurrency, rather. However, we shouldn't undermine the illicit money movements as well. So if we look at the graph here, we can see that roughly between 2 and 3 billion a year is actually moved illicitly. And those movements actually occur through various modes, whether it's dark markets, scams and Ponzi schemes, credit card vendors, and also through theft. And once a criminal has actually gained the money through these illicit means, the money is sitting in their wallet. And what criminals want to know is actually how can they convert that money into fiat currency without, of course, being arrested. And the need to kind of, launder the funds is the common thread among all of the forms of crypto crime. And so the inherent transparency of blockchain has actually allowed us to understand some of these money movements. And as we move onto a real case later today, we will see what that looks like. Tom, if you can move to the next slide. I want to show a little bit more detail around those illicit money movements that we're focusing on today. So if you look at the size of the problem for those money movements, those $2 to $3 billion US we've spoken about, mostly it's being laundered through dark markets, the vast majority through scams and Ponzi schemes, and then a small number, but obviously nothing that we should kind of forget about, through credit card vendors and through theft. So this is how this breaks down. Tom, if you can move to the next slide, please. So you're probably wondering how this behavior is actually driven today. And of course, a lot of the money movements through exchanges, as I mentioned, is just moved legally. And there are a lot of over-the-counter brokers that are doing this very legally and, are not abusing the system. However, there are some over-the-counter brokers or OTC brokers and unregulated exchanges. And the problem is that while most OTC brokers do run this legitimate business, some of them will almost specialize in providing money laundering services to criminals. And they have, their KYC requirements are a little bit lower than the exchanges that they operate on. And many of them will actually take the advantage of this laxity of the systems, and then they will help, the launderers actually move the cash. And unregulated exchanges are also a challenge because they're not obliged to actually help foreign authorities when they're investigating some of those illicit money movements. So even if they do have a KYC in process, they have no obligation to share that data with governments. Ideally, security audits should be added together with strict KYC and AML rules and standards to ensure that there is full transparency when it comes to money movements on exchanges. And finally, before I pass it on to Tom, if you could move to the next slide, I wanted to highlight a few examples of unusual activities, which I think might be useful as you think about, what are some of those red flags or alerts you should be looking at when you're dealing with virtual currencies. So, for example, repeated receipt of fund transfers from virtual currency exchanges, which is inconsistent with a customer profile. So that could be something that you look at a little bit closer, or multiple transfers going to one common end user. And as we unpicked the case in a second, you'll see that there were, multiple accounts that are used to collect and funnel funds to a small number of virtual currency accounts and to multiple exchanges. Let's not forget that multiple purchases of virtual currency at or just below $3,000 record keeping requirement should also be something that you take a closer look at and could indicate, some potential wrongdoing there. So these are just some of the examples of unusual activities to bear in mind as you start your investigations around virtual currencies. Now I'll pass it over to Tom, and let's have a look at what the Lazarus launderers have done.
Thank you very much, Nina, for that introduction. So, as Nina mentioned, I'm Tom Robinson, co-founder and chief scientist at Elliptic. And at Elliptic, we work with financial services businesses around the world to provide solutions that help them to combat financial crime relating to crypto assets. So today, I'm going to discuss how sanctioned actors are seeking to evade and bypass sanctions by using crypto assets in combination with the traditional financial system. In particular, we're going to look at a case involving North Korea and show how blockchain analysis can be used to identify and trace this activity. We'll also discuss how similar techniques can be used by banks to ensure that they are not handling transactions related to this crypto-enabled sanctions evasion. But before we do that, I want to briefly look at why cryptocurrencies are used in illicit finance. Any system for transferring value is going to be exploited by criminals at some point. But cryptocurrencies can be thought of a bit like digital cash, and their cash-like attributes do make them particularly suited to illicit transactions in some circumstances. So, for example, cryptocurrencies do not really respect national borders. Cryptocurrencies are basically data, and so like data, they are very easy to transfer undetected across national boundaries. Second, you do not have to disclose your identity in order to use cryptocurrencies. You don't need to open an account tied to your identity at a service provider like a bank in order to hold or transfer Bitcoins, for example. Cryptocurrencies are also difficult to block. The cryptocurrency transactions are difficult to block. And that's because there is no single point of control in something like Bitcoin. There's no single central entity that can freeze those transactions. Cryptocurrencies are also difficult to seize because, as I said, they're basically data. So they're very easy to conceal. I think it's also true to say that there are still gaps in the regulation of cryptocurrency businesses. It has taken regulators time to catch up with this technology and enact new regulations that address the risks. For example, crypto exchanges, where you can convert regular currencies into cryptocurrencies, still aren't subject to AML regulations in some jurisdictions, although a lot of progress has been made over the past few years. And then finally, because there is no concept of identity inbuilt into cryptocurrencies, they can be difficult to trace, although, as we'll see later on, that is still possible. So, in particular, crypto assets have begun to be used to evade global sanctions in a few different kinds of ways. So, for example, those actors that through sanctions have been prevented from using traditional payment systems can instead use cryptocurrencies as an alternative means of transacting, and so bypass those sanctions. We've also seen some sanctioned actors raise funds through token sales. This is where organizations can raise funds for an enterprise in the form of cryptocurrencies through the sale of crypto tokens that represent some kind of interest in that enterprise. So these are often known as ICOs. At the end of 2017, enterprises raised billions of dollars in cryptocurrencies in this way. We've also seen sanctioned actors engage in cryptocurrency mining. So, for example, if a nation state has the natural resources to generate electricity, then these resources could be monetized directly through cryptocurrency mining. Compare that with having to engage in exporting those natural resources, which can be more easily restricted through sanctions. And finally, cryptocurrencies have become a key tool used to monetize cybercriminal activities. And the case study we will look at today involves a sanctioned actor raising funds in the form of cryptocurrency through cybercriminal activities. Okay, so here we have a list of some of the most active and successful cyber threat groups currently active across the globe. These are basically groups of hackers that have been identified by security researchers as engaging in widespread cyber attacks. And what is interesting here is that all of these groups are actually strongly associated with governments. They're all believed to either be directed by or actually to be part of the intelligence agencies of various nation states. And there are actually clues in some of these names that indicate which particular countries are involved. So, for example, these four are believed to be associated with the Chinese government, these two with Iran, Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear with Russia. There is even a group associated with US intelligence, the Equation Group. And perhaps one of the most advanced and effective cyber threat groups in the world at the moment is the Lazarus Group. And the Lazarus Group is strongly suspected to be a wing of the North Korean intelligence agencies. So through Lazarus Group, North Korea has, over several years, been engaged in espionage, sabotage, and other activities with a particular focus on South Korea as a target. However, this changed in 2013. And this is when, in response to ongoing nuclear weapons tests and threats of preemptive nuclear strikes, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2094. This significantly ramped up sanctions on North Korea, imposing a ban on money transfers, effectively shutting North Korea out of the international financial system. One of North Korea's reactions to this was to redirect the Lazarus Group to help it raise cash through cybercriminal activity. And this is believed to be the first time that a nation state is known to have used its cyber capabilities to raise money. And it has been pretty successful at it. The United Nations estimates that the Lazarus Group has raised over $2 billion for North Korea. And it's done this in a number of different ways. So, for example, it has engaged in theft from financial institutions, either by infiltrating payment systems or through the compromise of ATMs. One example of this was the 2016 hack of the Bangladesh Central Bank. Lazarus Group hackers were able to use stolen SWIFT credentials to send more than 3 dozen fraudulent money transfer requests to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, asking the bank to transfer $870 million of the Bangladesh bank's funds to bank accounts in the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and other parts of Asia. Luckily, one of these payments for $20 million was to be sent to a Sri Lankan non-profit organization, but the transaction was held up because the hackers misspelled the name of the recipient. Rather than typing Shalika Foundation, they typed Shalika Foundation. This prompted one of the routing banks, Deutsche Bank, to seek clarification from the Bangladesh Central Bank about this transaction. It was at this point that they realized what was going on, were able to freeze these transactions. So rather than $870 million being stolen, the theft actually totaled $81 million. And these funds were laundered through various casinos. So in response to this, the US government has imposed sanctions on the Lazarus Group. They described it as an offshoot of the RGB, North Korea's primary intelligence agency. And they clarified that foreign financial institutions facilitating the Lazarus Group's transactions could themselves be subject to sanctions. And so for this and other reasons, the Lazarus Group at this point began to explore the use of cryptocurrencies to raise funds. For example, through the use of ransomware. So in May 2017, perhaps the most devastating ransomware attack to date hit hundreds of thousands of computer systems around the world. So if your computer was infected, you would have seen something like this on your screen. asking for around $300 worth of Bitcoin to be sent to a specific Bitcoin address. Now, according to US law enforcement, this ransomware was created by the Lazarus Group, and they were even able to identify the specific individual within North Korean intelligence who was responsible for it. One interesting backstory around this ransomware is that it was so successful at spreading between computer systems because it relied on a very powerful exploit of the Windows operating system. This was actually an exploit that was discovered by US intelligence, by the NSA. But this exploit was stolen from them, and it actually ended up being put up for sale on the dark web. So this is presumably how the Lazarus Group got hold of it. They were able to purchase it from those hackers on the dark web. And finally, the Lazarus Group has also been able to raise funds by stealing cryptocurrency from cryptocurrency exchanges, particularly in South Korea. Cryptocurrency exchanges are very tempting targets for hackers for a few different reasons, but mainly because they're simply easy targets. Many of these exchanges are quite small and don't necessarily have very sophisticated security infrastructure. The very nature of crypto transactions also means that they are irreversible, but also very difficult to trace, which can make it difficult to catch the thieves, and therefore makes it more attractive to these hackers. In 2017, 2018, around $880 million was stolen from crypto exchanges around the world. The United Nations believes that this was dominated by the Lazarus Group, who are believed to be responsible for over 570 million of these thefts. And so today, I want to look in detail at one particular case where the Lazarus Group stole funds from a cryptocurrency exchange. In this case, it was a Hong Kong-based exchange, from which they stole over $100 million worth of cryptocurrency. So we're going to look at how this hack took place and then follow the money to see how it was laundered, looking at the three key steps in the laundering process: the placement, the layering, and finally the integration. And we'll see how the integration involved traditional financial institutions such as banks and how they are key to this process. So I said we're going to follow the money, but how is that possible with cryptocurrencies? Well, luckily, the likes of Bitcoin are not actually anonymous. Every transaction is recorded in a blockchain. Every transaction that has ever occurred is publicly visible to everybody. However, as I mentioned, no actual identities are recorded. Instead, what we see is the movement of funds between addresses, where an address is just a string of letters and numbers. But at Elliptic, we specialize in linking crypto addresses to real-world identities. This allows us to trace crypto funds and see who is sending and receiving transactions. So in your media window, you should, in a moment, be able to see a video of our software as we trace the flow of funds into and out of the WannaCry ransomware Bitcoin wallet. So the circles are Bitcoin wallets, and the lines are real transaction flows between them. And here, first of all, we're looking at the inflows into the WannaCry wallet. So this represents people paying the ransom. And in general, those payments are coming from crypto exchanges. So the victims are going to those exchanges, buying some Bitcoin, and then paying the ransom. This software was used by law enforcement to follow the money and to help identify the links to North Korea. So if we look at the outgoing flows, we can see that the funds are going to various exchanges. And this provides law enforcement with leads to identify who is behind this attack. Okay, so back to our case study. How did the Lazarus Group steal these funds from this exchange? Well, at the end of 2018, an employee of a Hong Kong-based crypto exchange started to correspond with a potential customer. That customer was actually a member of the Lazarus Group. One of the preferred tactics of the Lazarus Group is known as spear phishing. This is where they seek to develop a relationship with an individual at the target organization with the ultimate aim of gaining enough trust to be able to somehow infect their computer system with malware. And so in order to do this, they created fake personas, such as this one. So these are basically fake people with social media profiles such as this. One of the individuals they invented was this person, Wally Darwish. And when they created the persona, they created LinkedIn profiles like this. In fact, you can still find this on LinkedIn if you search for this person's name. This person doesn't exist. He's simply an invention of the Lazarus Group. So once this fake persona was able to build a relationship with the exchange employee, they eventually started sending emails with attachments. These attachments, of course, contained malware, and as soon as the exchange employee opened the attachment, the malware infected the exchange's computer systems. From there, it was relatively simple for the Lazarus Group to steal over $100 million in cryptocurrencies from this exchange. Okay, so Lazarus at this point have stolen the cryptocurrency. What do they do next? Well, they're certainly very sophisticated hackers, but they are not specialists in money laundering. And so their next step was to transfer these stolen funds to someone who could help them do that money laundering. And we can use our blockchain analytics software to see exactly where the money went next. So in the next video, I'm going to follow the stolen funds in our software. I've sped the video up so that it doesn't take too long. But what you'll see is that the funds are sent to hundreds of single-use wallets before all then being sent on to another cryptocurrency exchange. So the funds start at the victim exchange and then are sent on, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so the funds are sent through many, many new wallets before being sent to the exchange. And they're doing this to hide the source of these funds and also to split up this large amount of money into smaller transactions which are less likely to raise suspicions at this exchange. So each circle here is a different Bitcoin wallet, and the lines are the transactions between them. So the stolen cryptocurrency was sent to another exchange. Specifically, it went to accounts controlled by two individuals, believed to be professional money launderers, called Tian Yin and Li Jiadong. Of course, they didn't use their real identities when setting up accounts for this exchange. These are the photos that they used as part of their KYC process. And what you can see is that they actually used the same image of a person and then pasted on different heads and different backgrounds. So it clearly wasn't difficult to bypass this exchange's KYC policies and use alternative identities. So that was the first stage, placement of the stolen funds by transferring them to these professional money launderers at another exchange. The second stage is the layering, where the criminal proceeds are further distanced from their source. So what we'll see is another video from our software looking at the stolen funds leaving this exchange and where they go next. What we'll see is that the funds are sent through a large number of complex transactions through many intermediary wallets before eventually being sent to wallets controlled by one of our money launderers. This is all real transaction data visualized from the Bitcoin blockchain. So then what we see next is the first step of the integration. So these individuals are now sending the funds to other exchanges, and specifically exchanges where they can cash out their cryptocurrencies for regular currencies. So, through a complex web of transactions, the stolen funds find their way to another exchange. And in particular, an exchange where the cryptocurrency can now be converted to regular currencies. And this is where the proceeds are transferred from the crypto economy back to the traditional financial system. The fact is that there still aren't many ways to actually spend cryptocurrencies. And so we generally see criminals cashing out back into regular currencies. And of course, this movement of funds back into regular currencies involves traditional financial institutions. So the crypto exchange they used will itself have a bank account, and this account was used to transfer the proceeds of this theft to numerous other banks where these two individuals held accounts. So this case illustrates that financial institutions such as banks are facilitating sanctions evasion originating in cryptocurrency, although generally they might well be completely unaware of this. And this will be a growing trend that banks need to be aware of and which needs to be addressed. So what can banks do about this? How can they prevent themselves from being used to facilitate sanctions evasion through cryptocurrency exchanges? Well, the first step is to identify whether a bank's customers are receiving funds from cryptocurrency exchanges in the first place. One technique used by some banks to do this is keyword searching. So here, transaction data is searched for references to specific terms, such as Bitcoin, that are related to cryptocurrencies. Other more specific keywords and identifiers are available from providers such as Elliptic. For example, you could use bank account numbers associated with crypto exchanges, legal entity names, and so on. Once you have identified that one of your customers has received funds from a cryptocurrency exchange, the next step is to assess the risk posed by that specific exchange. There are hundreds of exchanges all over the world, and some are much higher risk than others and are much more prone to misuse by sanctions evaders and criminals. So some indicators of a low-risk exchange could include the fact that it is regulated in its home jurisdiction. So the local regulator is responsible for overseeing its activities. Another indicator of low risk might be that the exchange has strong AML sanctions KYC policies in place, which are actually being implemented. Also, the banking partner can say something about how risky the exchange is. Banks often do their own due diligence on the cryptocurrency exchanges that they work with. And you could also use blockchain analytics to identify whether a given exchange has been transacting with high-risk entities such as sanctioned entities, dark markets, and so on. Some indicators of a high-risk crypto asset exchange would include whether there is in fact no local regulatory requirements for crypto businesses. Conversely, whether there is no or little KYC required to sign up for a given crypto exchange. It's still the case that some exchanges can be used with nothing other than an email address. One indicator of riskiness can also be whether a given exchange supports privacy coins. So these include the likes of Monero, which are cryptocurrencies that are much less transparent and much more difficult to trace than Bitcoin. And for that reason, they are sometimes more associated with illicit activity. And then finally, blockchain analysis, again, can be used to identify whether a given exchange has been transacting with any high-risk actors, and therefore might be involved in money laundering activities. And again, providers such as Elliptic can help with this type of risk assessment by providing detailed risk profiles on specific exchanges, making use of these types of factors and more sophisticated ones as well. Okay, to summarize, we've seen that sanctioned actors are using crypto assets to evade sanctions. In our particular case, it was North Korea. We've shown that blockchain analysis can be used to follow the money and gain valuable insights about how the money is being laundered and where it's going. We've seen that financial institutions are integral to the cash out process. So despite this activity originating in crypto assets, in general, traditional financial institutions become involved at some point. And finally, we've shown how banks can implement processes to detect exposure to crypto assets and crypto asset exchanges and assess the risk that this poses. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions on any of this at the end of the webinar, but at this point, I'll hand back over to Nina.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I've seen a lot of questions actually come through. Feel free to post them in the Q&A box and we will pick them up in a few minutes. But before we go there, Tom, if you can move ahead, I would like to touch briefly on the regulatory landscape and what that looks like today. So I think the kind of general consensus is that cryptocurrencies and virtual assets in general are not as regulated as potentially kind of dealing with fiat currency and some other, other money laundering regulation that we have in place that affects more traditional transactions. But there is some regulatory guidance. There are various countries and various regions that are doing something about it. So let's look at what that looks like and try to unpick a few of those. So the FATF, international body that sets standards for anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing, is saying that there is an urgent need for all countries to take coordinated action to prevent the use of virtual assets for crime and terrorism. So, of course, there is an ever-increasing need to regulate the currencies. And, as I said, we know they're not as regulated as they could be. And, as Tom has talked about, and as I've touched on at the beginning, money laundering knows no borders and kind of money movements as well. And so we need to be aware that coordinated action across borders is absolutely something that we should be striving for. So even in traditional money laundering, not for the use of virtual assets, we know that discrepancies between local and global regulation kind of exist. We know that there are different requirements and they're problematic. There is kind of global or more international guidance, but then sometimes it does not quite align with that local regulatory requirement. And that is a challenge that absolutely needs to be addressed by all regulating bodies. So if we move to the next slide, please. We have, however, seen some efforts in this. So what we talked about today Next slide. Yes, thank you. So what we talked about today is that we know that virtual asset transactions are instant, they're face-to-face, and they're cross-jurisdictionals, and they're largely anonymous. So there is kind of this need to bring them within the scope of regulation. And so, of course, I talked about cross-jurisdiction collaboration, which is absolutely necessary. And so the fact that they are anonymous makes them kind of harder to trace. It makes them attractive to criminals. But what we have seen, for example, and most of these things have happened in the last couple of years, but in some more recent history at the beginning of this year, we've seen that Austria has done an on-site inspection plan and AML supervision. We've seen an exchange which has ordered to freeze bitcoins to identify suspected hackers. We've seen international financial investigation units a meeting together to discuss virtual assets and what they can do to deal with them. We've seen a first enforcement action against crypto exchanger as well. Former head of Europol has highlighted that 3 to 4% of continent's annual criminal take-ins are crypto laundered. So there's more exposure and more visibility of these issues. 2 to 5% of global GDP is actually washed away annually. So these are some huge problems. We talked about the sizes of these problems, and we mustn't undermine them. So we have a responsibility as participants in this industry to ensure that they're dealt with appropriately. And finally, Department of Justice has charged those 2 Chinese individuals we spoke about today, so Yin Yin and Jian Dong, for laundering over 100 million US dollars in cryptocurrency. So again, not huge steps. These are all small steps, but they're very important in how we are approaching virtual assets going forward. If we could move to the next slide, please. So the FATF, I spoke about as that international body that sets standards and recommendations. They have addressed virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, more commonly known following that paper as VASPs. But they have published the interpretative note to a recommendation, and it was issued in 2019. So although this note was issued in 2019, the members of the FATF do have some time to implement it. So they have until June 2020 to implement it. And that ultimate responsibility on how this is being implemented, remember, these are just recommendations and guidance. So that ultimate responsibility actually lies with national regulators. And so we are aware that these national regulators have the right to take the recommendation, interpret it in whichever way they want. We know that most likely we'll come up with different regulatory requirements in different regions, but regardless, everybody has to do something. And the clock is ticking here. We're not far away from June. And so there is absolutely urgency to become compliant. If we move forward, please. Aside from just that, international cooperation is absolutely critical. I have mentioned this, but it is the only way to beat the criminals. Money movements know no border, and nor do the criminals. They will absolutely use all systems possible to actually move money illicitly. And so we have seen that European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, has participated in giving guidance related to virtual assets. They have published a report around licensing regimes of fintech firms. We've also seen that Egmont Group, so those financial investigation units are starting to think about this. In their annual report, they've addressed that, they kind of had some challenges. I mean, they've addressed the challenges around emerging financial technologies, and they have addressed virtual assets as well. So there is, more awareness of virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. Therefore, the regulators are actually starting to address them. If we could move to the next slide, please. Although a lot of this and a lot of the things that I touched on are actually guidance, Some regions, some countries do have obligations already when it comes to virtual assets. So, for example, we know that, the fifth money laundering directive, is actually regulating exchanges, wallets, and ICOs. We have to be mindful that this is a directive that only came into effect early this year. And we still don't have proof that obviously all member states from the EU have implemented it. There is a transposition of the directive that's happening in many countries right now. We have more and more regulation. The environment we live in is fast changing. Therefore, the criminals are absolutely finding new ways to launder money, and the regulation is responding to that. But it is the obligation of national authorities and therefore entities that operate within that jurisdiction to implement it. And sometimes they do take a little bit of time. So institutions, if we could move forward, please, Tom. So as we kind of, move forward, institutions should identify effective systems to conduct a risk-based approach. For digital currencies as well as fiat currencies, they absolutely need to keep a track of what is going on with those transactions. And they need full audit trails for both purposes, internal and external. So they not only need to explain internally what's going on with the transactions if the audit is performed, but also to work with those regulators and enforcements if they come to visit and talk to them. FATF has also advised that the designated threshold above which VASPs are required to conduct customer due diligence to be around $1,000 or euros. So we do have that as a part of the guidance, and it is something that we should think about as we implement our risk-based approach. And finally, our final slide for today, what I really want to stress, if we could move to that slide, is that it's very important to distinguish good from bad at the onboarding, right? So if we do the due diligence right to begin with, so once you're onboarding your customer, truly understanding who they are and what their network looks like can actually help you manage them a little bit better as the time passes, manage them better as you're doing ongoing monitoring, and actually understanding the transactions that they're making as they do business within your institution. I want to stress something right now, which is kind of very topical and very relevant. There is we're currently obviously living in kind of weird times. We have a pandemic that we are going through, but at the moment there is a flurry of regulatory guidance that is coming out. And so that is kind of driven through the scams and fraud and cybercrime that we've seen as a lot of institutions are moving digitally, especially to onboard new customers digitally, given that we don't have that human interaction at this moment in time. So you should absolutely ensure that you are on top of those, that guidance that is being issued, to try and avoid any misses and reputational damages. So to actually try and do that, make sure that you're on top of, the guidance that is coming out pretty much regularly every couple of days. So that's it. Tom, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that before we look into questions?
No, but very happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Let me have a look. We've had quite a few come through. Okay. So I had a question actually that was relating to some of the figures that we've seen before in the slides. Specifically, when are they from? So all of the figures that I've shown that come from Elliptic's internal research actually go through years, but the latest numbers that I've focused on as I was talking were actually linked to 2019. So those were the figures from 2019 that we looked at. Let me have a look. So one of the questions says, you mentioned a number of red flags for crypto exchanges, including information derived from blockchain analysis. How can banks make use of these red flags if they don't have a blockchain analysis capability? Tom, would you like to take that?
Yeah, so some of those flags I mentioned can be determined through traditional due diligence research. But yeah, some are dependent on blockchain analysis, which will require new capabilities to be developed. So you can either do this yourself by using a tool like the one I showed videos of to trace transaction flows into or out of exchanges, or an alternative product that we and other companies provide are detailed risk profiles of crypto exchanges, which includes blockchain analysis within them. So rather than having to do the analysis yourselves, we can do it for you and just tell you the results. So that's a product we offer called Discovery.
Thank you. Another question that I have here is, was the 2.3 billion laundered just using Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies? That relates to those stats that we looked at. And how does this compare to more traditional fiat currencies? Perhaps I can just touch on fiat currencies as well. So money laundering is a huge problem through fiat currencies. And it is obviously a lot more money is laundered through fiat currency, but we have to bear in mind that cryptocurrencies are still fairly new. And of course, not everybody is using them. So the traditional money laundering is there. It hasn't gone away. But the money laundering through cryptocurrencies has become increasingly a problem. And as we talked about that, it is due to some of those challenges around, perhaps transparency or, the lack of regulation around it. Tom, did you want to comment around those 2.3 billion?
Yeah.
I mean, I believe it was all cryptos, but if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so that figure was specific to Bitcoin. And in 2019, that represented less than 1% of all Bitcoin transactions. So less than 1% of all Bitcoin transactions could be associated with illicit activity. So that percentage is very small, and in fact, it has gone down a lot over time. So back in 2012, it was more like 7%. 7% of Bitcoin transactions could be associated with illicit activity. But I think a lot has changed over the past 8 years or so. Law enforcement has become much more sophisticated and more able to stop this kind of activity. The regulatory environment has changed, so exchanges are much more likely to doing anti-money laundering checks. And the blockchain analysis capabilities have also developed, so it helps the exchanges to be able to detect when they're receiving illicit funds and prevent them from being laundered, which has a knock-on effect on the source criminal activity in crypto.
Thank you. Somebody has asked us, how can a financial institution safeguard against privacy coins? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Tom.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, privacy coins are cryptocurrencies where, in most cases, the blockchain is not visible. So you can't see the details of transactions and you can't trace them back to their source. And so it means that we can't build blockchain analytics capabilities for them. And so you need to be able to deal with the risk in a different way. What we've seen some exchanges do, for example, is support privacy coins, but have much lower transaction limits on them than they would with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, just because of the unavailability of those blockchain analysis tools.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. Will there be any moves to shut down anonymous currencies like Monero? It's a tough question.
Yeah, so I guess the regulatory approach to cryptocurrencies in general to date has been to not seek to regulate the currencies themselves. It's to regulate the gateways, the exchanges that enable people to move between traditional assets and crypto assets. I think even if that changed, it would be difficult to enforce. It would be difficult to shut down a distributed system like a Monero. Specifically on Monero, it does seem to be much more highly linked to illicit activity than something like Bitcoin. A report released yesterday showed that I think nearly a third of all dark web listings, for example, accepted Monero as a payment option, and that despite Monero being much less widely used in general than something like Bitcoin.
Thanks. There's a question here actually that talks about onboarding. So I don't mind picking this one up, but it says, when onboarding, is a digital questionnaire ample, or should the financial institutions be conducting face-to-face or over the telephone interviews with prospective customers? That really depends. You know, we've talked about the risk-based approach, whether you are dealing with digital currencies or fiat currencies. When you are onboarding your customers, that will depend on your institution and their policies that they are adhering to. The policies that the institution, have typically come out of the regulation or regulatory guidance from the region. So, as I said throughout the presentation, the FATF, Volcker Group, various other institutions or international bodies, rather, will issue guidance that most kind of internationally countries will follow to set their regulation. So once the regulation has been set, various institutions like financial institutions will put policies in place to follow the regulation. And therefore, from there, the compliance analyst can decide how to onboard that customer. In some instances, some institutions absolutely require kind of face-to-face checks and onboarding. But obviously, as a lot of businesses are moving digitally, especially as we see, a lot of challenger banks coming into place. When we talk about these crypto exchanges, a lot of them are also digital. Therefore, potentially their onboarding is also done digitally. That's not to say that you shouldn't have some liveness tests as a part of that or identity verification. So a questionnaire could be filled by anybody, but ultimately what are the other steps that you're going to take to protect your organization is what you should be thinking about. Okay, let me have a look. Loads of questions. I'm trying to go through them. We have a question around, can Elliptic trace which wallet service was used by tracing the public key that was used for transactions completed at Bitcoin ATMs?
Yeah, so we work to identify as many cryptocurrency addresses as we can, and that does include Bitcoin ATMs. So we have a data set of crypto addresses that we know belong to various ATMs around the world, and we can even tell you which ATM specifically is involved and where that's located.
Okay. Another question, why would criminals use Bitcoin for money laundering if it's traceable?
That's a good question. So in general, it's only traceable as far as a cryptocurrency exchange. If the launderer sends funds through exchanges which are non-compliant, which aren't keeping records, which aren't doing anti-money laundering checks, then those exchanges can be a bit of a dead end. So I think at the moment, tracing capabilities are here, but regulation isn't still completely widespread. And so there are still opportunities for launderers to use those unregulated services to hide their trail, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because ultimately a lot of money being laundered today traditionally, obviously people used cash to launder money, and it is the easiest way to do that still, right? But a lot of money laundered today ultimately ends up in those financial systems. So when we talk about some of the traditional money laundering, it's also fairly traceable. It is just how well it was integrated into that system or not. And that kind of links back to what you were talking about earlier, Tom. So, it's not like the kind of criminals are just trying to find the ways which are not traceable. Obviously, if it's not traceable, it's easier for them to do so. But ultimately, we have to be mindful that even if it's traceable, they can still use it for illicit purposes. Okay, well, I have plenty of questions still here. I think we're coming to the top of the hour, so Tom and I can pick up some of those questions and respond to you following the webinar. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that the presentation was useful for you. Feel free to connect with us, and we will send out the recording to all of you so you can have a look at it at your time. And we'll also do a little write-up following the webinar on what we've discussed today that will be shared with all of you. Once again, thank you, Tom, for your time, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.